Equity of democracy, the source of all fundamental rights in a democracy, and a right in itself, both at law as well as in equity. Even when there is no Bill of Rights in your constitution, and even if your constitution does not mention democracy specifically. What is this equity of democracy? Now, in 1890s, when the framers of Australian Constitution were doing conventions to decide how different colonies should come together into a federation, they had the model of Canadian Constitution in front of them as well as the US Constitution in front of them. And US Constitution has a well-known Bill of Rights since ages, since its inception. And they also had the Magna Carta and British example in front of them. And yet they specifically said we don't need Bill of Rights in our constitution because we are having a democratic society anyways. That much confidence in democracy. Why? And why is it that just because they were going to have a democracy meant that they don't need Bill of Rights? They never use the word equity of democracy. This is what I am calling that feeling about democracy. But before I explain that, let me say few quick words about equity and fundamental rights to explain everything better. Equity was a result of ecclesial courts in England which tried to soften the impact of law on citizens. Law is harsh. Law is always harsh. But what softening the impact of law meant was there are situations when something is not right according to the law. But when you, as an outsider, look at the situation, you somehow feel, nah, that is right. The law says it's wrong, but you feel, nah, that is right. That's how it should have happened. This is where equity steps in and relieves the person of the legal burden. There's a saying that equity follows law, but if there's a clash between equity and law, equity prevails. So even if law says one thing, but equity says the other thing, the equity prevails. Equity is the conscience. When your conscience says something is right, it is right. What is equity of democracy? It's a feeling that comes into your heart when you think of democracy. You identify democracy. When you say we have a democracy, you have an image of democracy in your mind and you know what democracy is about. You know what is democratic and you know what is undemocratic. If something is undemocratic, you know that is not right. That is your conscience. Your conscience knows that this is not undemocratic. That conscience, that democratic conscience is the equity of democracy. Fundamental rights. Most of the work on fundamental rights was done by European scholars during the time of Enlightenment. Some fundamental rights have existed before that, and other well-known sources of fundamental rights are Magna Carta as well as Bill of Rights of US Constitution. But originally fundamental rights were based in religion. So European scholars tried to explain how man, who is a special creation of God, deserves some rights, which they call fundamental rights. That was the basis, the origin of fundamental rights. But subsequently some rights have emerged out of Bill of Rights, like free speech, and then Magna Carta and democracy as well. But what I see now is, I think within next 10 years, reason will replace religion as a moral yardstick. We will determine morality based on reasoning and not on religion. But even if that doesn't happen, I am trying to base fundamental rights on the basis of reason. And there's a good reason, as I've already given you an idea what the conscience of democracy is, what equity of democracy is. Let me delve a bit further into it. Continuing with the example of the Australian conventions, even if our nation's constitution does not say that we are a democracy, but it only says that people are going to vote and decide who is going to govern them. Even though it does not say we are a democracy, it straight away brings democracy and equity of democracy into picture. And all the fundamental rights flow out of that. How? You are casting your vote to elect people to govern your society. They are your representatives, not your rulers. King had the divine right. British democracy might still be a reminiscent coming down from royal hierarchy, and now royalty might be under it's a complex story. Let's not go into the British example, but anyway, the thing is, like, in a democracy you are electing representatives. Your representatives' power is not derived from the constitution. The constitution is there because you have accepted that constitution as your constitution. That constitution gets the power from you. You can change it as a society. You can replace that constitution. Every constitution contains provisions as to how it could be changed. If there is no provision, then people will change it anyways. Constitution represents your will, that this is what we want our society to be like. Your representatives are like your agents. You are the principal. Individually, you may not have a control over representatives, but collectively, you have chosen them to be your representatives. They are your agents. Their rights cannot extend beyond the power you grant them. And the power you grant them is limited by the constitution you have put in place. But because they are your agents and you are under law, they are equally under law. In fact, your representatives are under two laws. If they do a mistake in their own capacity, then they are answerable to law. But if you as a society do a mistake, then as your representatives, they are still subject to law. So they are under double control of law. They are your agents. Straight away, you know all the rights, like all the writs of mandamus, writs of habeas corpus, injunction, and all those things, all those legal remedies flow straight out of this aspect, that it is your representatives who are governing them and they are answerable to you as a democracy. Because they are answerable to you, and that this is how you can make them work through the court system. Those writs come out of that. Then in democracy, majority decides who is going to be in the government. But once you have put them in government, you also give them a time to be there. You can't take them back. But of course, everything they do, you may not like that. You may want change. And of course, minority may have their own issues that they want to discuss with people. And the only way democracy improves is through dialogue. So free speech is not a fundamental right because of any other reason, but simply because democracy will not work if there is no free speech. If you have an issue with something, the only way you can bring about a change in democracy is by discussing it with other people so that there is a common ground on that issue, and then people vote based on that issue to bring about that change democratically. Right to free speech is directly linked to democracy, to the equity of democracy. Then every organism, every living being has a basic right to defend itself, the right to security. Humans are no different. Police cannot be everywhere, and if police was everywhere, there will be too much curb on freedom, which is not what democracy is about. So if police can't be anywhere, then how are you going to defend yourself and people who depend on you? The right to bear a simple firearm, like a simple small caliber gun, or a shotgun. That's a natural right. That's not even a fundamental right. It's a right to defend yourself as an organism. It's your natural right. But democracy takes this two steps further, or maybe more than two steps further. In democracy, once you have elected the government, you have no power. You have no power to take it back, because that's a contract. You have given them a contract for a certain time that they are going to govern, and under the constitution, they have a lot of powers. Bad things happen, and then there are bad people. Like there are instances where people from army usurp nations' democratic governments. How are you going to defend your democracy? How are you going to defend your way of life? You cannot fight heavily armed militias with handguns and shotguns. Your right to bear heavy caliber firearms, one of the fundamental rights in Bill of Rights of the United States, emerges out of democracy. How are you going to defend democracy in modern day and age? This is the basic requirement. This is how that fundamental right emerges. We can talk about any fundamental right, and you'll see how it is directly linked to what democracy is about, and how you're going to promote democracy, how you're going to evolve democracy, and how you're going to protect democracy. Everything will flow out of that. But that's not what equity of democracy is all about. It goes much further than that. As I said, it is both a right at law as well as a right at equity in itself, other than the fundamental rights that emerge out of it. Now, what does that mean? Majority elects the government, minority already does not have a voice. The way that majority government is restricted is by the way of constitution, that you cannot go beyond the scope of this constitution. However, the thing is, you may have common view on certain issues and different views on other issues, but you have elected a government, but all the issues are not discussed at an election. And some of the issues are like that if a government brings out a law, it will not affect even a minority of the population, but it will only affect a few individuals, or maybe even one or two individuals in the entire population. That's how personalized the effect of those laws could be. Currently, the courts use the yardstick of constitution to see whether a law is valid or invalid, but that is not enough to give relief in some cases. This is where equity of democracy steps in its two form, as an equitable relief as well as in legal relief. Now, it's reasonable to expect that all issues will not be discussed at the time of elections. And even if all issues were to be discussed, people do not vote for a particular party or a person based on one issue or two issues. People consider a lot of things, and they let go of a lot of things. They make a lot of compromises. And then modern day and age, everything is unpredictable. Many things can happen, and government has to deal with issues. It is reasonable to expect many more issues to emerge for the government to deal with than what they might have discussed during the election time. And the other thing is, government will always have a range of choices, from very sway to very lenient to choose from. And most of the time, most of the governments will stick to the middle ground, but a bit more on the swearer side most of the time. So most of the time, the government will make a choice to deal with an issue. It would be slightly on the swearer side. The only time government goes for the lenient options is when they want to please people because of political reasons. But it is reasonable to expect. However, sometimes what happens is, like, what is conscience? You feel something is not right, and that's where the equity of democracy comes in. There might be a law which only affects a few individuals. Now, it's a democratically elected government, and it has got every right to take decisions under the constitution. But still, it has brought out a piece of legislation which courts cannot strike out on the basis of constitutionality because everything is right constitutionally. Yet that legislation has affected the rights of an individual. What does that individual do? The equitable right emerging out of equity of democracy is that if you look at that, the legislation, and you think that it is inequitable in the circumstances for that law to apply in that situation, then that person deserves equitable relief because of the equity of democracy. Because one person cannot hold the government accountable at the next elections. Because as I already said, elections are not decided by one issue, and one person, not even one person, even a minority may not make an impact on elections. That's how weak minorities and especially individuals are. So the only saving grace for an individual is for a court to look at the equity, at the conscience of the matter at hand, and see the law is right. There's nothing invalid about the law, but it is not equitable in these circumstances, and because of the equity of democracy, this law is not applicable to this person. That is the equitable right. But there's a legal right as well. There may be instances where there is a law which is again legal according to constitution and everything, but it still feels out of place in a democracy, and people are like, this law shouldn't be there. This doesn't sound democratic. There could be many reasons. There could be an international treaty because of which a new law is being brought in, which may not affect anyone at all. But because it is a democracy, that law shouldn't be there. It does not fit in there. That's when the legal aspect of equity of democracy comes in. It may be reasonable to expect that the government will deal with any issue and will reasonably make could reasonably make a swear choice, but there might be instances where the court might have to think, was it actually reasonable to make this decision? If it was not reasonable to make that decision, that is invalid. That legislation, that law is invalid, not because it's unconstitutional, but because it's undemocratic. And that's emerging out of equity of democracy. However, there could be times when the court thinks, okay, it is reasonable to expect that the government might make such a decision. Then the second question is, could it be reasonably expected that a reasonable government, there are too many reasonables involved here, is it reasonable to expect that a reasonable government will go to the public for a plebiscite or a referendum before it takes this decision? If in that case the court finds the answer that the government should have taken public opinion and decided according to the public opinion, then that law is invalid as well. Not because it is unconstitutional because any other reason, but because it's undemocratic. Because equity of democracy does not allow undemocratic laws in a democracy. That's what equity of democracy in short is. It is still a work which needs a lot more development, but I'll leave that to the legal scholarship. Think, people, think.